Okay, so my name is David Gee. I'm retired from a post of senior scientific advisor at the European Environment Agency in Copenhagen, where I was responsible for emerging issues and science policy interface matters concerning all aspects of the environment and public health. So my name is David Gee. I'm ex-scientific advisor at the European Environment Agency in Copenhagen.
Okay, tell me about the precautionary principle as it applies to electromagnetic fields.
Okay, well, the precautionary principle came into law really in the early mid-1980s in Germany, when one of their precious assets, their black forests, was in danger of deterioration from which they didn't quite know what the causes were. There were several competing ideas. Pollution from fossil fuel burning was one of them, but it wasn't so certain that that was the principal cause. But they didn't want to hang around and wait for 20 years of research before trying to save their forests. So in order to justify their actions on not totally understood evidence, they invented the precautionary principle and put it into the German law. So that gave the government and the civil servants and the decision makers the legal, and behind that the moral right, to try and put right this hazard before it got too late. So it was a kind of, we could have translated the German word as foresight. In my view, that's a better way of seeing it. It's the foresight principle. You're trying to anticipate future harm by acting on the beginnings of initial harm, where the evidence is not overwhelming, but it's good enough, particularly if the harm is irreversible and likely to increase. And from there, the precautionary principle spread to the marine environment, where we had to act on chemicals in the sea and on fish stock preservation well before there was overwhelming evidence of hazard or problems, in order to save the fish and save the seas. And then nowadays it's in about 60 international treaties. But it's very much a European creation, and we find that some of the US people have difficulty with it as a legal concept. Although in practice, in many decades past, American authorities have acted with great precaution and with some foresight in order to head off problems. So, for example, they were very early in the actions on protecting the ozone layer. And they were very early on not having the BSC tragedy, which we had in Europe. So American life has been precautionary, and it depends really on the political complexion of the day. Whereas the 70s were very precautionary, the 80s weren't, and it swung with the politics. So it's a kind of a socio-political scientific concept that enables you to avoid future harm by acting in good time.
Okay, tell me, like in the field of genetically modified stuff, have there been scientists that have been harassed for coming out with studies? Tell me their stories and what happened to them.
Okay, well, when you look at the history of all the big known hazards, either to the environment or to health, or in many cases to both, there are 34 of those case studies collected in the 2 volumes that we produced at the European Environment Agency called Late Lessons from Early Warnings. And you find that those scientists who produced the initial early warnings invariably were harassed, sometimes very severely in terms of loss of their careers, other times in terms of harassment at conferences and things like that. Many of them suffered enormously. So you look at the history of asbestos, and Professor Selikov, a US scientist, stands out as somebody who was severely harassed by the asbestos establishment. In the field of GM, of course, in the UK, we have Putzai, who was severely harassed by the establishment here in the UK. Back in history, you have Ibsen's wonderful play, An Enemy of the People, which is about a public health doctor who gets harassed. And then in the field of EMF, you've got people like Leonard Hardell has been harassed, and Ulle Johansson has been harassed, Deborah Lee Davies has been harassed, Herbie Huberman, Dr. Huberman, I think, has been harassed. So in all of the fields, all 34, you can point to harassment. Chapella is another one from the GMO field from California. And this is not too dissimilar to what happened to Galileo. If you come out with an inconvenient truth, as Al Gore put it so well in relation to climate change, then it's inconvenient to powerful forces, and those powerful forces will fight back invariably. The history of lead in petrol, which is essentially a US story, is littered with the 4 key early warning scientists, each of whom got harassed. In particular, Professor Needleman from Pittsburgh, who died recently, unfortunately. He's a co-author of the chapter on the history of lead in petrol in our book, and he was really very severely harassed, had to stop his work for 3 or 4 years whilst defending his reputation.
What happened?
So it's a common feature.
What happened to Deborah Davis?
I don't know the details because, as with many of these things, they often end up in the legal sphere. And as you know, many legal settlements come with a clause that says don't tell anybody what's happened, and that's part of the deal. So I don't think there's anything in the public domain about the details of what happened to her, but she certainly was, ejected from a very promising position in the university early on, as it were. You'd have to ask her what the details are. But many people have to sign gagging clauses if they're going to get decent compensation for a lost career opportunity or something like that. My understanding, based on inadequate knowledge, because not everything has come out about that story, is that they too were part of this long litany, this long list of harassed early warning scientists for what they were saying about radio frequency radiations from particularly mobile phones, which was a very inconvenient truth. And the other people like Hardell have also suffered from speaking inconvenient truths to power. One of the conclusions we have from our book is society ought to do something about this phenomena, because from a societal point of view, early warning scientists who are robust and honest and so on are useful, like canaries in the gold mines, to the rest of society. So we should be encouraging them. And I'm working on things like, could we get the Royal Society and the National Academy of Sciences to put out a code of practice that says early warning scientists will be treated well, and our professional organizations will make sure that there's not another Galileo coming along, and that people who are speaking inconvenient truths to power will be protected by the establishments, the professional establishments of scientists. Sometimes people will make a mistake. In science, mistakes are made all the time. But if they're made honestly and with integrity, we can live with that. And that way, I think we might be able to encourage some of the younger scientists who are currently put off from going into controversial fields like GM or EMF or nanotech even, because they have seen the controversies that surround these fields. If society said, we're going to help you and protect you better, if you come up with an early warning issue, then I think many younger scientists will be encouraged to go into controversial fields, which would be a good thing from society's point of view. Now, okay. I just know about Putzai.
So what happened to Putzai?
He was removed from being a very senior person with a great track record in science, I think over 200 publications in his field. And he was removed from a senior position because his experiments were showing, according to him, that GM was not quite the innocuous agent that the establishment wanted to believe. And that was very much an inconvenient truth that seemed to go right to the top of the political establishment, and he was removed summarily and refused access to his data and that sort of thing, which is just deplorable.
Okay, now in the U.S., a lot of times they say, I don't know if you know anything about this, and if you don't, that's fine, but in the U.S., they very often in various studies say, oh, industry is not funding this, but yet, like, I understand that Monsanto funds a lot of universities, so they fund the universities, so therefore people can't publish unless it comes out what Monsanto says. If you know anything about that, if you could phrase it in a usable form, and if you don't know, that's fine.
Yeah. From the history of all of the case studies that I mentioned, you find that corporate-funded science, either directly to the particular scientists or indirectly through universities, or more indirectly through front organizations that they create with fine-sounding names like the Tobacco Research Council and so on. You've seen in that field and in climate change and in asbestos and in GM and so on, a lot of industry-funded stuff which invariably comes out biased. You can put in a 4x4 table those studies that are independently funded by public scientists and those that are not so independently funded, and the second group invariably find no hazard or little hazard, and the first group invariably find hazard at the same time of historical development of the knowledge base. So it's a well-known phenomenon, funding bias we call it, and to get around that you just have to finance research that is done independently of the vested interests. And if that means, for example, in the phone industry right now, why don't we put a 30-cent tax on every phone that's sold, put that into an independent fund, ring fence it and so on, and then feed that into the universities to do the research that's badly needed in this field, given the numbers of people that are exposed to EMF fields and to mobile phone technology. We should do that. In the past, the US, in the early days of getting rid of the chemicals that were putting a hole in our ozone layer, they put a tax on those CFC chemicals that was small to begin with and increased every year, and the total revenue from that tax was pushed into researching the alternatives. We should be doing something similar with mobile phones, so as to minimize future hazards. It's a great technology, it brings lots of benefits, but we can avoid a lot of the hazards by doing enough fundamental research into what's going on here biologically. We have enough early warning signals ever since Hardell's studies of 1979, and then the International Agency for Research on Cancer's overview back in 2011 saying, at this stage in the history, it looks like it's a possible carcinogen, the radio frequency from mobile phones. It's not a probable, but it was pretty close. I think if IARC now re-looked at that data 6 years on, it would be a probable carcinogen. So we need a bit more research into how can we eliminate the plausibly damaging radiation from phones, retain the benefits of the technology, and just minimize the hazards. That needs a bit of research. That should be done by independent scientists.
Okay, now anything else you want to say about the health conditions that you feel that you can speak about in genetically modified materials, or glyphosate or EMF?
With regards to GMOs, I'm not an expert at all in GMOs, although one of the chapters we have in the book is about the origins of that story, but it's more about how perhaps innovation in agriculture is crude in the sense of genetic engineering. It's a very simplistic, mechanical, crude way of trying to boost the output of food and so on, when nature and the food and agricultural system itself is much more complex, and there are smarter ways of innovating within agriculture which don't just deliver on the gross output of the wheat or whatever, which is the focus of GM, but which simultaneously improves the water retention capacities of the soil. It expands the biodiversity, it introduces crop diversity, it helps to cope with floods and with climate change. In other words, it tries to address all the complex systems that are agriculture. That's called smart innovation in my book. And when you look at the funding by the EU or by member states or by the US, you find a lot of money is going into the simplistic GM single bullet crude way of trying to boost output, and very little is going into the much more sophisticated, much more challenging and much more interesting and much more scientifically rewarding field of innovating within the whole agricultural system. Another thing that struck me about this field, looking at it from the outside, and I was turned on to this by Stephen Drucker's book, was the parallel between computer engineering and genetic engineering. So in the computer engineering field, the software engineers who create the programs, they know that they are creating a program of software which they understand because they create it. But it has complexities within it, and so it doesn't behave as it should sometimes, even though they've invented it. And therefore they do a lot of pre-market testing, and then when the product is out there, there's a lot of post-market testing and retesting. As unintended consequences occur, the program doesn't work quite as well as it should, so they adjust it and then retest the whole program. When you think of the GM people, first of all, it's nature's bioinformation system that they're trying to deal with, about which we know so little. And they're inserting an item into it with unintended consequences, of course, but they don't bother with any really decent level of pre-market testing or even post-market surveillance and testing. And the contrast between the two fields is, when you look at it from the outside, really startling. I think some of the top computer software engineers are, quite frankly, astonished at the way in which the genetic engineers handle their complex systems and their insertions and their failure to test or monitor and so on. And I think very few of the public and very few scientists not engaged in those two fields have kind of perceived this stark difference between bioengineering and computer engineering.
Okay, do you know anything about government interference? Somehow are these companies getting to the government and,
Well, yeah. I'm afraid if you look at the period we've been studying with these case studies, it lasts about 125 years, I suppose, since the early warnings on climate change, benzene, asbestos, and X-rays, which were all in the 1890s, would you believe? Credible early warnings on those four areas. Since then, although corporate power dominates all of the stories, the power that corporations now have and have managed to achieve for themselves in the last 20 years is much, much greater, and they're much more in bed with government agencies. A lot of people talk about this not just from the field of health and environment, but it's a general problem for our democracies, that the corporate grip on democratic governments, both in Europe and America and elsewhere, is very, very strong, and is not healthy for democracy. And of course that produces attempts to not get the right kind of research done, or to stop various lines of research, or to steer money in particular directions that are more favourable towards the corporation's short-term profit agenda. And the only saving grace is that some corporations are bucking the trend, and they're talking about what would socially responsible innovation look like. Would it be GM really from the world's point of view, or would it be different, agroecological research, for example? And one or two companies in, for example, floor coverings, what's that European corporation called, that realized that instead of selling more carpets and floor tiles, they just ought to sell a service of floor coverings. In other words, they would go from selling products to selling services. Now, this is one of the best ways that we can try and meet our needs of the 9 billion people with less pressure on the planet if we use resources more intelligently and more eco-efficiently. And if you've got a corporation that's selling products, its business is getting the material out of the door and sold. If you get a corporation that's selling a service, a floor covering service, then its incentive is to save as much resources as it can, because it's cost to them really in a way that when they're selling products it's not. So selling services, this is called demand side management, or moving from demand to supply side. Actually, delete that last sentence. I'm mixing that up a bit, but yeah. So moving from supplying products to supplying services has got to be part of a trend that the better corporations can see will be better for them and better for the planet.
Has Monsanto interfered with Europeans' governments or policies at all?
Yeah. Do I know the details of that? I think from the little I know, there's been quite a significant amount of corporate pressure on the decision-making bodies in Europe, and in the area of, for example, glyphosate right now, which is highly controversial because it's one of the top-selling pesticides in the world. The decisions by IARC a couple of years ago to categorize glyphosate as I think a 2A carcinogen has really upset a great number of people, including Monsanto, and they, through their influence, I think, have helped to persuade or influence the European regulatory authorities into concluding that there's no real hazard from glyphosate. So that's a very interesting controversy right now, where very prestigious regulatory bodies that evaluate the science are coming to virtually opposite conclusions on the same body of evidence.
How did they, just a second, this is a little quicker. How in the world did they conclude that glyphosate is not safe? What is safe? How did that happen?
Well, I don't know the details. I haven't got the details of that in my head, but I ran a workshop 3 years ago, no, 4 or 5 years ago, which was entitled, which was focused on how do clever experts who are not biased by money or other, venal interests, how do clever scientists in different groups of committees look at the same evidence and come to opposite conclusions? So I had 4 case studies, one of which was BPA, one of which was radio frequency radiations from mobile phones, one of which was ELF radiations from overhead power lines, and the other one was pesticide spray drift. And in each case, I got the chairs or a senior figure from 2 different committees who had looked at the same evidence and come to opposite conclusions. And the purpose of the workshop was not the truth, whatever that might turn out to be, but how did they manage to do that? And we had 18 reasons at the end of the workshop. And it starts off with things like, what paradigm are you using? So at the heart of the controversy on EMF right now, there are 2 paradigms in play. The establishment paradigm says that EMF, if it doesn't have enough energy within it to raise bodily temperature, raise the temperature of the tissue that it hits in a body, if it hasn't got sufficient evidence for that, it's regarded as safe. Now the upcoming paradigm, which is being developed to explain why we've got an excess of brain tumours in people using telephones for 10 or 15 years, they're saying that paradigm is out of date, it's crude, it's simplistic, and they're interested in information physics. In other words, the language of cells that talk to each other through tiny amounts of electromagnetic fields, and it's that conversation between cells which is getting scrambled by this low energy input from the mobile phone technology. So if you start off in one paradigm, and we know from the history of science how difficult it is if you created your career for 50 years on a paradigm, for some young person to come along and say, actually, the world is round, not flat, very hard to change your paradigm midway through. So those senior colleagues who are in the establishment positions within the regulations of EMF are still stuck with the old paradigm. I think within 10 years, the new paradigm will be the predominant one, and it will explain the rising tide of tumours that seem to be associated with mobile phone technology.
With GMOs associated with mobile technology?
GMOs?
That's what I thought I heard.
No, I don't think so. No. Did I say that? I said, I'll just read.
Yeah.
I'll just do the concluding sentence of that. So with these 2 paradigms, I'm quite convinced that within 10 years, the information physics paradigm, which can explain biological harm from low energy levels of EMF, that will become, if not the predominant paradigm, at least accepted by a large number of scientists. And the older paradigm that says, unless it heats tissue, it can't be harmful, that will be thrown into the dustbin of history.
Okay, anything else?
Yeah. When you look at the histories of the case studies that we've studied, you find that knowledge that doesn't come from scientists is often the first bit of knowledge that identifies a hazard. So, for example, if you take something like DES, the pharmaceutical pill that was given to pregnant women in the 50s and which has led to a whole host of reproductive cancers and other harm, both to the daughters and sons and now to the granddaughters and sons of those early women who took that pill as a morning sickness pill. The first case studies popped up in a Boston hospital, and it was a rare tumour, and the doctors couldn't work out why they got 6 or 7 rare tumours in one hospital, and they talked to the mothers of these young women who were 26, 27 with the tumours, and the mothers, 1 or 2 of the mothers said, well, I took a pill 27 years ago, and I think that was the cause of this bloody mess. Go check that out. They did a quick case control study, published it within a year, and the evidence was so strong that the US government banned DES on the basis of that. Now that's just one example of what I call lay and local knowledge, and it's in the GM field, it's in the asbestos field, it's in lots of the fields where astute parents or workers or members of the public, citizens, they just see stuff, put 2 and 2 together and get 4. Not always right, like scientists, they make mistakes, but one conclusion of our reports was pay more attention to lay, local and traditional knowledge, because it is very often more accurate and more robust and more foresightful or precautionary than much of the establishment science. Well, developing the theme that a lot of robust knowledge comes from lay, local people, citizens, workers, parents, and so on. It follows that if we create a society which is an open society, where the freedom of information is paramount, and where as many details of what's in the food and what's in your products and what's being governed and what's being provided to you through the marketplace, all of that should be really openly available to people, because that would just maximize the numbers of citizens who would then play a good role in asking the right questions about whether the benefits of this product is really worth this kind of risk and so on, and perhaps steering the whole society into more socially responsible innovation. At the moment, the model is if it sells in the marketplace, this innovation, then it's good for everybody. People are now saying, just because it sells in the marketplace doesn't mean to say it's the right kind of innovation. So let's step back a bit and think about what kind of innovations would make sense in agriculture, in energy, in transport systems, and move us to a less corporate, short-termist dominated agenda to one that's responsive to society's needs.
Do you think the corporations are giving money to the lawmakers in the U.S. or elsewhere?
I would not be surprised to hear about all kinds of means of influencing. I know if you look at the PR budgets, for example, of the major corporations, they used to be pretty small 20 years ago. They are mega now. So a lot of money is spent on PR consultants in Washington, in Brussels and elsewhere, and that's bound to be having some influence really on events. The public probably doesn't know the extent of it enough, and maybe people like you and others should spread the word a bit more to make the public aware of just what kind of money is speaking to who in their sources of government, really.
Anything else?
Independent science, we've done that, early warning scientists and so on. There's a whole heap of stuff to do with argumentation, really, and understanding. So, for example, there's an area to do with from Descartes onwards, we often see the world as either this or that. It's subjective, objective, it's black, it's white, and so on. And that kind of thinking gets in the way of understanding complexity and also continuums. But that's a bit too abstract for this.
No.
One of the lessons we get from the scientific side in all of these case studies is that very often at the front end of a history of a hazard, the establishment will say there is no evidence of harm. And that's roughly interpreted to mean evidence of no harm. And it very rarely is that. When people say there's no evidence of harm, very often it means the relevant studies over the relevant time period just have not been done. And so it's good to remember that no evidence of harm does not mean evidence of no harm. You need the right research done over the right time period. As if, for instance, in the histories of lung cancer and smoking, asbestos and lung cancer, at 20 years, we didn't have any evidence of harm from the cancer because the latent period in which the tumour grows from first exposure to full tumour happened to be 25 years. So when we did the studies 25 years from first exposure, tenfold excess of lung cancer emerges. So you have to have the right studies over the right period of time, and if you've got that negative, then you can say no evidence of harm is evidence of no harm. But very often that is not the case. Homo stupidus, which is what we actually are, and we could aspire to Homo sapiens maybe in a couple of 100 years' time.
Okay,
Yeah.
and can you state that you give me permission to, I might not have brought a consent form.
Oh, yeah, that's
so
fine.
can you state that you give me permission to use this in my films?
I give you permission to use all that I've said in your films.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Now, what were we going to do before I suddenly remembered
You're
about evidence
thinking,
of harm?
you're thinking of binary.